Hey guys, what's up? It's Nicole and today is President's Day. Now I know this is not a holiday in other countries, but it is in the United States. And so today I just want to talk to you guys about my favorite presidents of all time. Today I'm just going to focus on the good things they did that better furthered the country. Because a lot of presidents in the past did something good that's still around today that you probably didn't even know that they did. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so the first president that I want to talk about is actually our very first president, and that was George Washington. Now, I'm pretty sure everyone has heard of George Washington. He was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War against Britain. When the war was won and the United States had been formed, or America had been freed from Britain, Washington had a chance to take the power for himself. He could have declared himself king, and I'm pretty sure everyone there at that time probably would have gone along with it because they loved him. He had stood with his people, with his army. He had trained them and fought with them side by side. He was not a coward, and they all worshipped him, basically, and they wanted him to take over. Now, he could have declared himself king, but he didn't. Instead, he resigned, he gave up his rights, and he basically just went home. And because of this, he's been compared to the ancient Roman Cincinnatus. I think that's how you pronounce his name. I'm going to put his name on the screen so you guys know who I'm talking about. Cincinnatus was just like Washington. He served Rome during a crisis when they needed him. But when that crisis was over, he was given the opportunity just like Washington. But he didn't take it either. He resigned and he also returned home because they did not want that power. They just wanted to help. And because of this, when the elections were held, Washington received 100% of all of the electoral votes, and until this day, he is still the only president to be unanimously voted into office. The only one. Because everyone agreed that he should be the president. As the very first president, there's a lot of different things that he did that are still here today. He shaped our government. He made things sort of the way they are now. But that would be a really long video to tell you everything he did. So I'm just going to focus on two things that he did instead. And hopefully you take the time to look into it yourself. Okay, so first of all, remember that at that current time, America had just liberated itself from Britain. But America, just like every other country, cannot make everything they need within their borders. So the problem became they needed to trade. And yes, they could trade with other countries, but Britain had things they needed too. So that meant they had to sit down and they had to talk it out, because at that moment, there were tensions between America and Britain, and that was not going to go away overnight. So Washington decided to have a sit down and try and figure out a way to negotiate the problems out of the way, because they needed to trade with Britain, and Britain still needed to trade with America. There was lots of unfarmed land, lots of resources there that they could use, and they could fight and take it back, but they wanted to negotiate. When these negotiations took place, Washington negotiated with a man named John Jay. And this treaty was designed by Alexander Hamilton. If I can find pictures of them, I'll put them up on the screen. I don't know if there are any pictures, so we'll see. The treaty resolved a lot of different issues that came out of the Treaty of Paris. It also strengthened the economic relations between Britain and America, and mostly avoided the war that was on the rise, basically. That was the entire purpose of it, to avoid the war. The second good thing that Washington did while in office was he created the U.S. Navy. Now, this was probably a big feat and a very big accomplishment because we still have that same Navy. Now, we have better technology and better ships and battle defenses and all that, but back then, that was not something that we actually had. our ships were being protected by France and Britain, basically. But after everything that happened, they were left vulnerable. And pirates were attacking them. People were being forced into slavery and goods were being stripped. Washington had to do something. He had to fix this problem because he was our president. The people had elected him and he was failing to protect American ships. So he sat down and thought it over and he came up with the idea of creating our own naval fleet. This was known as the Naval Act of 1794. The second president that I want to talk about today is our third president, and that is Thomas Jefferson. Now, the reason why I like Thomas Jefferson is because he did a lot of good things in office too, but he's widely known for the Declaration of Independence. He was chosen to write that. And in the second sentence of the Declaration of Independence, there is a common phrase that's everywhere. I mean, it's everywhere, and it's called "all men are created equal." And Thomas Jefferson, he was very unique as a president because he's the reason why a lot of the states I have listed above are even a part of the United States to begin with, because he validated, or rather, he purchased Louisiana. Now, you're probably thinking, Louisiana, what is that? And if you're not in the United States, you probably don't know. You might know, and I know a lot of people in the United States who don't actually know or have a distinct memory of it. But the Louisiana Purchase was basically Jefferson buying a bunch of land from Napoleon for $15 million. The Louisiana Purchase took place in 1803. It doubled the size of the United States at a sum of 3 cents per acre. And by far, it's been the largest territory gain in history. The largest, because that was the biggest piece of land the United States had ever purchased from anyone. And it was all because of Jefferson. He thought that we needed it, and now we have it. Now it's a part of the United States. And it wouldn't have been, like, for him, we never would have had it. Now, after he made this purchase, he immediately recognized that that was a lot of land. Definitely too much land for him to cover, and too much land for him to send people out there not knowing what's there. So, the first thing he did, and you probably remember this from school, is he asked 2 different people to go and map it out. And those people are famously known as Lewis and Clark, or Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Now, the story of Lewis and Clark is long and commonly known, so I'm not going to get into what that is. If you guys want to know about that, maybe I'll link a video down below about it. The next best thing that Jefferson did as president happened on December 2nd, 1806. This occurred during his annual message to Congress, where he called for criminalization of the slave trade. The act prohibited slaves from being imported from other countries to the United States, which means no new slaves would be stolen from their homes across the sea and forced to come to the United States, which was a big milestone when it comes to slavery back then. Now, which means no new slaves would be stolen from their homes across the sea and forced to come to the United States, which was a big milestone when it comes to slavery back then. Now, this was the first time a president had actively tried to do something about slavery. And that is one of the things that I liked about Jefferson. He started something, and other presidents after him took notice. The next president I'm going to talk about is by far one of my favorite presidents. You probably already know who I'm talking about, and that is Abraham Lincoln. Now, there are lots of things he did in office that were pretty cool and pretty good, and I'm going to talk about a few of them. So, the first good thing he did that I want to focus on is the signing of the first Homestead Acts. The Homestead Act allowed people to purchase land at little to no cost, basically. The Homestead Act allowed people to purchase land at little to no cost, basically. And that was for anyone who had never taken up arms against the United States, anyone 21 or older, and anyone who was head of a family. They could go in, file an application, and basically just get land. Now, of course, that resident had to reside on the land for several years and had to show proof that he was upkeeping the land. But as long as he did that, the land was his. This was a big thing because back then, a lot of the land you got was basically just for rich people. Rich people had land and poor people did not. And it was very hard to overcome that. So Lincoln basically just abolished the whole thing. He was like, land is not just for rich people, it's for everyone. And so he made it possible for the poor to also own land as well. The second good thing he did was on May 5th, 1862, he established the Department of Agriculture. It was to be commanded by a commissioner without cabinet status, and Lincoln liked to call it the People's Department. Because of Lincoln, today, the USDA remains responsible for developing and executing federal government policy on farming, agriculture, forestry, and food. A third thing he did was he signed the Morrill Land Grant Act. So on July 2nd, 1862, the Morrill Land Grant Act was signed into legislation by Lincoln. Now this act allowed for the creation of land grant colleges on the condition that the proposed institutions would teach military tactics as well as engineering and agriculture. And this act actually led to the creation of numerous universities that are still here to this day. And some of them are known as the best colleges and universities inside of the United States. And that's because of Lincoln. On July 1st, 1862, Lincoln also signed the Revenue Act of 1862. This basically just created the IRS. Now, it wasn't what it is today, but that's basically what it was. He created the IRS. And it introduced a system where taxpayers were separated into multiple categories, and that was based on their incomes, and they were taxed accordingly. Now, that was a good thing because a lot of people were just taxed the same amount. It didn't matter if they were poor, it didn't matter if they were rich, they were taxed the same amount. And Lincoln didn't think this was fair. He thought that the poor were being exploited. So basically, he just created a system where if you're poor, you pay this amount. And if you're rich, you pay this amount. And the IRS kept track of that. The next thing he did is actually the thing that he's most famously known for. And that was on January 1st, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which basically started the procedure for slaves to be free in America. It started by allowing black soldiers to fight for the Union against the Confederacy. It also it was also a precursor for the 13th Amendment. He couldn't see the enactment of the amendment because, unfortunately, he was killed in April, and the amendment came into play in December. But without him, that probably never would have happened for a very long time. The last thing that I want to talk about is something that I don't think a lot of people actually know, and that is that Abraham Lincoln established the nation's first national currency. Because in 1863, he signed the U.S. National Banking Act, basically. The next president I'm going to talk about is he's pretty well known, and that's Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is known for a lot of different things, but the first is he's well known for being the youngest president to ever run and be elected and be in office, basically. Now, how it happened is after Vice President Garrett Hobart died of a heart attack. He took over for him, basically. And he was the vice president from March to September in 1901. And then after the assassination of President William McKinley in September 1901, one of the biggest things he's known for doing is destroying the Beef Trust. Now, if you don't know what that is, basically, in 1902, he directed Attorney General Philander Knox. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He directed him to bring a lawsuit on antitrust grounds against the Beef Trust that monopolized half or more of beef sales. Now, during that trial, it was demonstrated that the big six leading meat packers were engaged in a conspiracy to fix prices and divide the meat market amongst themselves. Basically, they wanted to make more money, and they wanted people to pay more for a product that wasn't even worth it. The Supreme Court ruled that the government was allowed to regulate monopolies if it had a direct effect on commerce. So, effectively, he destroyed the Beef Trust, and he made it known that presidents can, in fact, control monopolies, which is why it's so hard for monopolies to form. Now, we do have Disney, who seems to be growing up there, but they are not a monopoly. I know a lot of people say they are, but they aren't. Now, after dealing with the Beef Trust, President Roosevelt went further, basically, and he passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. Now, if you don't know what the Pure Food and Drug Act is, it basically banned food and drugs that were impure or falsely labeled from being made, sold, and shipped. Which is basically why in every drug that you see, the ingredients are on the back, because he made it that way. He made it illegal not to do that. And that has shaped the industry, basically. He also passed the Meat Inspection Act. Now, basically, the Meat Inspection Act aimed to prevent adulterated or misbranded meat products from being sold and to ensure sanitary conditions for slaughter and processing. This made sure that all the meat that was processed and all the animals that were slaughtered in healthy conditions so that people weren't made sick by the food they were eating. And this also cost the meat industry a lot of money, because at the time they didn't really care what conditions they were doing this in. They just cared about shipping it to customers and getting that profit. And Roosevelt was like, you can't do that. And he changed it. So, the next president is also well known, and that is Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, one of the things he is known for, definitely, is that he is the longest running president. He was the only president to serve 3 terms. And the last president as well, because right after he served that 3rd term, the 22nd Amendment came into fruition, basically. Which basically meant that no other president after him was allowed to serve more than 2 terms. And that was passed, so obviously it was deemed reasonable. Franklin also, or FDR also created the Emergency Banking Act. So, his first 100 days of presidency started off basically by closing all banks for several days until Congress could pass reform legislation, basically. The second thing he did was create the FDIC. Now, the Temporary Emergency Banking Act was followed by the 1933 Banking Act, also known as the Glass-Steagall Act. FDIC provided deposit insurance. It's that symbol that you see on all the banks when you go in to deposit something or open an account. That is there because of FDR. Now, basically this means if anything were to happen to the economy and you had $100,000 in the bank, the government ensures that you'll get that $100,000 back. They insure up to $250,000. At least most FDIC banks do. It's made banking a lot better, definitely more reliable now, because we don't have to worry about our money being gone. Like if the economy were to fail and we have money in the banks mostly can cover it. They'll front it back to you, or at least they'll get it back to you. You'll be reimbursed. You'll get that money back. But before he did this, before FDR was even in office, that wasn't a thing. Which is why the Great Depression tore everybody apart, because people didn't have money. They didn't have anything. They couldn't take care of themselves because any money they did have was in the bank, and the bank lost it. So FDR ensured that this would not happen again. Along with establishing the FDIC, FDR also did something else, and that was he created Social Security. Now, a lot of you already know what that is. Most of you probably are already on it, and Social Security was not something that was there before the Great Depression, but he figured that it was the government's job to get people back on their feet. And so he established Social Security. The Social Security Act was enacted to provide economic security for the elderly, poor, and the sick. So basically anyone disabled, anyone who couldn't manage to take care of themselves or take care of their family on low wage, which is something that is still true today. A lot of people can't take care of themselves on the money that they're getting. Like, some people work 9 to 5 and they still cannot afford to pay their rent and put food on the table. So that was the purpose of Social Security, to take care of the elderly when they couldn't work anymore. That was the purpose of it. And FDR thought it was the government's job, because up until then, no other president really thought that it was the government's job to take care of the people that way. They helped, and they passed bills and things that helped, but they did not physically give money to the people because they did not think that it was necessary. But FDR passed this law. He thought it was needed, and it was, and it's still intact today. He was the president that established minimum wage. Now, before him, there was no such thing as minimum wage, and he passed legislation during his second term, including the Housing Act of 1937, which provided subsidies to local public housing agencies to improve living conditions for low-income families. And the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 was also passed in his second term, and it introduced the 40-hour work week. The next president I'm going to talk about was both loved and hated like many presidents before him and after him, and that was Dwight Eisenhower. Now, I could show you guys a long list of things he did, but I am actually going to take the time to talk about a few of them because they're really important. Because he was the president who established and created NASA in 1958. Now, that's a huge thing. Seriously, that is a huge thing. Because without him, there never would have been that Apollo landing. Okay? So, you've all heard of the space race. And that refers to the 20th century competition between the Soviet Union and the United States for supremacy and spaceflight compatibility. Now, many of you probably already know this, but the highways were thought up by President Eisenhower. Okay, the reason for this, on June 29th, 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower enacted the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, authorizing the construction of the interstate highway system, which we happen to all use today, and is the fastest way to get from one place to another if you don't want to get in an airplane. Basically, he did that. He thought it up. He made it happen. He thought it was the best way to get from point A to point B. And so, initially, the U.S. spent $25 billion for the construction of 41,000 miles, 66,000 kilometers basically, over a 10-year period. It was the single largest public works program ever to be done in the United States. So that is all that I have for today. I do have other presidents that are my favorites, but I don't want to make this video too long. It's already too long as it is. But thank you guys for watching. If you have a favorite president from the past, let me know down in the comments below. Also, what did you guys do today for President's Day? Did you grill out? Or did you eat in? Did you watch a special movie? Did you go somewhere? Let me know. Look out for one of my reaction videos. I'm thinking of releasing one later tonight. And I hope to see you guys Wednesday.